This audience has a bit of the look of one of Pershing's regiments at the end of the first day of the Musargan. Sadly thinned, bedraggled, a bit fatigued, but will muddle through. I want to start with a moment of silence so that everybody can please turn off your cell phones, if you haven't done it already. What can we say about the life of George Washington, aside from the obvious fact that it is purely a narrative construct with no meaning or value in reality? Professor Nelson seems to be one of the casualties here, but lest there be any other stealth postmodernists in the audience, we can refer to him simply Washington as one of the meaningless, valueless segments of the impenetrable maelstrom, who for convenience sake we shall refer to as George Washington. Let me start out with explaining, well, I don't take it for granted anymore that anybody knows who I'm talking about when I talk about George Washington, but even more so that anybody will understand what I'm talking about when I talk about the papers of George Washington. I speak frequently about the Washington Papers Project where I work, often at patriotic organizations, DAR, SAR, other organizations, and I would say on the average, perhaps 10% of my audiences have ever heard of the papers of George Washington. The Papers of George Washington is a documentary editing project, and no, that does not mean we make movies and documentaries for the History Channel. It means that we have a collection of copies of all known letters to and from George Washington through the course of his entire lifetime. We are engaged in transcribing, editing, annotating, and publishing these letters. We have been based at the University of Virginia for some 40 years now. We have published 60 volumes of Washington's correspondence. We have approximately 30 volumes left to go. These are not little volumes, these are big doorstop volumes in small font, lots of notes, running to approximately 700 pages, sometimes in excess per volume. The entire corpus of Washington's correspondence amounts to some 135,000 documents. And we are literally finding, I'd say, a new document pops up at least once, sometimes 2 or 3 times a month. They are literally popping up in people's attics. I had a call not too long ago from the personal secretary to a Texas oil man who had been digging through his employer's drawers, just cleaning things out, and he found in the back of one drawer, lo and behold, a 4-page Washington document letter, all in Washington's hands, never published before, never known of before, from 1773. His employer just bought it some time ago and forgotten about it, so he asked if we would like a copy. So these things are popping up all the time. We're publishing these things not just in print editions, but we have a digital edition now that is available by subscription at most good universities have this by subscription through the University of Virginia Rotunda Press, but there is also a free version available online at the Mount Vernon website where anybody can go and browse through fully searchable Washington's correspondence. We are funded largely and could not exist without the National Endowment for the Humanities. Bruce Cole is a major part of that, has been a major part of that. We could not exist without his constant help. And it is partly because of the NEH that the Washington Papers Project won the National Humanities Medal in 2005. So this is a major project. However, I have to say that the Washington Papers Project and other founding era projects called the Founding Father Projects, the Franklin Papers, the Jefferson Papers, the Adams Papers, and others, have been largely ignored and neglected by both the the universities in which they're housed, scholars, and the general public. Our own University of Virginia, a number of years ago, decided that the Washington papers consisted of a collection of second-rate clerks and attempted to force us into the basement of the university in a windowless, leaky room. We reminded them that we are historians and scholars and professors at the university, and eventually held on to where we were staying. Many books are published by scholars, by self-professed scholars on Washington, often tenured faculty at different universities, on the Revolutionary War, on different aspects of early American history that make no reference to the papers of George Washington documentary editing project, and indeed do not seem to know that we exist. A recent book published on the life of Steuben has no reference to the Washington papers. A recent book on espionage in the American Revolution makes no reference to the Washington papers. Many, many more books are constantly coming out that really have nothing to do with us. And something of that, I think, has to do with kind of the faddish move away from empirical research, which we've all witnessed in the last 20 to 30 years. All this is ironic, of course, in part because of Washington's own view of the importance of his papers and his legacy. And I should mention as an aside that probably 40 to 50% of Washington's entire correspondence is taken up with the Revolutionary War and his military papers. Washington viewed his papers as a species of public property, sacred in my hands, he called them. He said that no history of the founding of our country, and he wasn't boasting, but he was saying no history of the founding of our country could be written. No history of our victory in the War of Independence could be written without reference to my papers. And therefore he viewed them as a national trust. When he was on his deathbed, some of his last words, his last earthly concerns were the care for his papers. I could go on about how those papers, that collection, was systematically destroyed in the early 19th century and what a labor it's been to pull it back together, but there's no time. Washington's correspondence, specifically pertaining to the subject of our current panel, reveals a number of facets of his own views on the military's role in society and civil-military relations that really seem to have eluded many Americans in the 21st century. George Washington, it seems obvious to say, was a soldier. In youth, because he aspired to be, because he wanted to pursue the military life, he saw it as something potentially glorious. But in later years, not because he aspired to military greatness, but because he believed that was where he could best serve his country. Now, Washington's views, you can't really understand Washington as a soldier without considering his views on duty, which were rooted in his admiration for classical virtues and values and his admiration for the tenets of Stoicism, and also, obviously, in his military service. Now, of course, he lacked formal military training, but he did also study military science and military history quite extensively as a young man. He would, when he was in Barbados with his older half-brother Lawrence Washington convalescing there, he would probably go out and watch the British garrison there drill and learn about what the military system was like. As Americans have historically done, however, and in this way Washington is the archetypical American, he learned most of what he knew about the military on the job, particularly during the French and Indian War, when he fought on the battlefield. And he also, and this is one of his great unknown achievements, but perhaps one of his greatest, he crafted the first true regular military force in American history, the Virginia Regiment. It's a great epic story, one that Again, I could go on about endlessly. It's fascinating. Few people know about it. After that war ended, though, after the French and Indian War ended, Washington, who had really by then lost his taste for the military life, recast himself as a planter and as a Virginia politician. Even as a civilian, however, he knew that he had been formed by military service. And in 1775, when all men of ideals, and he was one of them, sought means to serve their country, he donned his uniform and appeared in Congress as a soldier. This was not, here's another misconception about Washington, not because he was hyper-ambitious. And many historians have done a disservice to him by saying that it was his ambition. He really wanted to lead the army. He wanted to become great. But it arose from his sense of duty. Washington believed, and it is very hard to get at the core of his beliefs on morality, on religion, and all of these sorts of things, but we can say that Washington believed that Providence lays out for every man a certain role that he must play in life. It sets before him certain duties and responsibilities that he must fulfill to the extent of his ability, whatever his innermost feelings about them may have been, whatever his doubts may have been. Now, Washington, at the beginning of the Revolutionary War, when he shed tears to Benjamin Rush in fear that he would fail as commander of the Continental Army, those were genuine tears. They were not crocodile tears. They were genuine tears. He was genuinely afraid. He prized his legacy. He was worried about what future generations and contemporary generation would think of him. It was his greatest fear, but he felt that this duty, this responsibility had been set before him. He had no other choice but to carry it out. And that's why he took command of the Continental Army. It should be emphasized that he really took no pleasure in his role as Commander-in-Chief of the Army. In fact, if you read his correspondence, it seems more like sometimes he's the complainer-in-chief rather than the commander-in-chief. He could complain with the best of them. That was one of his great abilities. But he was an idealist. Joe Ellis, those of you who've read him to the contrary, Joe Ellis views Washington as a pragmatic realist. I really view Washington as a very passionate believer, a very passionate idealist, who learned in the course of the war that other men were not necessarily willing to make the same sacrifices that he was willing to make. And that forced him to adjust his ideals, forced him to adjust his attitudes towards his fellow men to what they were able to do, what they were willing to do. And he sometimes became embittered about it. But he surrendered himself to his duties. As a general, Washington was a mediocre tactician. But he was thorough, he was meticulous, he was a disciplinarian of himself and of others without being a martinet, and he was also a fine leader of men who won their love in a way, as I shall describe, that perhaps saved the Republic. During the war, with extreme care, he managed civil-military relations. You cannot read his correspondence, his military correspondence, without seeing this concern running constantly through his letters. Washington, as a general, understood, as few other men of his time did, that the army depended on the civil institutions of the country for its existence. That the army could not win the war without the support of America's civilians and America's civilian government. Therefore, he maintained very carefully his relationship with Congress, with governors, with local officials, and even everyday civilians. And this appears in things not just such as the preventing of looting and abuses, though he's constantly worried about that, but in forging personal relationships. Understanding that you didn't just wait till a crisis to call upon your allies in the government, just as many Americans have the view that you just wait for the crisis to pull the armed forces off the shelf, and when the crisis is over, you put it back on the shelf, you don't think about it anymore. He viewed this personal relationship between the military and the civil as crucial to the future. Many of his generals didn't understand that. Benedict Arnold being an obvious case, whose fall in many ways dates from his clash with the Pennsylvania governor, Joseph Reed. At the same time, Washington was a champion of his soldiers, and he demanded their just dues from the civilian rulers of the country. No one worked harder than he to collaborate with Congress to manage Army reform, pensions, and other benefits for veterans and their families. Let me give a very brief historical example that I'm sure many of you are already familiar with. And by 1783, as many people forget, Yorktown did not end the war in 1781. By 1783, the civil-military gulf in the country had grown dangerously wide. The economy was in a state of collapse. There was a lot of misery in the country. But most critically, this gulf that had grown up between the Army and the civilians had become critically dangerous. The Army distrusted civilians. They distrusted civilian government. They distrusted civilians. There was a lot of bitterness about the stay-at-homes, the people who had not served or who had served briefly and then gone back to manage their farms or their businesses and prospered while the soldiers were out fighting. At the same time, civilians were suspicious of the military and of the Army for fear that it would indeed, when the time came, try to take hold of the country. That example of Oliver Cromwell was always there before people. And what this led to is a well-known example is the so-called Newburgh conspiracy at Newburgh, New York, when the officers in Washington's army threatened, and this was a very popular notion, either to march on Congress or to withdraw into the countryside and let the British do as they would with the country. As these pamphlets and leaflets passed through the army, and this idea became very popular, as we all well know, it came down upon Washington to end this movement. It was in many ways the Revolution's greatest crisis. Without it, the country would have fallen in some way. And there's obviously that moment, that symbolism of Washington appearing before the army, putting on his spectacles, saying, "Gentlemen, while I have grown gray in your service, I have also grown blind." It's one of those great dramatic moments of history. I often like to think what else he might have done, how he might have waved his sword around, appealed to the battles. But what he was appealing to and asking his officers and soldiers was to remember was how he cared for them, how he worked at his desk day and night for their survival. And for soldiers, obviously the image that their officer cares whether they live or die is a critical one. Now obviously there is the symbolism of Washington stepping down from power at the end of the Revolutionary War and indeed at the end of the presidency. This is one of the great moments in American history, and its symbolism remains incredibly powerful today. Let me discard for a moment the nonsense that Washington could have become king. Although the Mount Vernon Visitors Center has trumpeted this in one of their exhibits, and you still hear about it constantly today, Washington could not have become king. There was no constituency for him to become king. There was never any serious offer for him to become king. Washington was playing a role in the final act of the nation's liberation that he believed had been predestined for him, and he was not the only one who believed this. His countrymen believed that this was the necessary act, this was the preordained act, whatever their beliefs may have been, that this was the preordained act for him to step down. James Madison said, I don't believe Washington could have become king even if he had secretly yearned for it, which he did not. And nevertheless, his fulfilling that act was part of who he was, and it was part of the capstone of the great experiment. And to sum up, these and other lessons, which I can only really talk about briefly with Washington, have been lost in many ways at the intersection of academic snobbery and pop history. We've all witnessed, I think, in some degrees, both of these things. I can recall at a recent conference for study for 18th century studies, which is one of the very few academic historical conferences where military historians can still talk about military history. But there's kind of an uneasy coexistence with this phalanx of postmodernists who are trying to take the whole thing over. And then there are a few Napoleonic war specialists who kind of do their own thing in separate sessions. I came to this conference because I'd been asked to fill in as a commentator last year, and I was introduced to the keynote speaker, who was a die-hard postmodernist, real true believer. And the gentleman who introduced me to her said, well, here's a fellow who's written about George Washington, a few books about George Washington. She kind of sneered at me and turned away. Then in her keynote address, she made some disparaging remarks about the Founding Fathers industry, which were obviously impromptu and inspired by my daring to appear there. And then went on to indulge in her fantasies about the meaning of the middle class. I've seen this in my own experience. I went to undergraduate school at George Mason University, and I still really love my memories of that place. It's superb faculty in the history department, most of whom were left of center, indeed, but they believed in the study of history. There were military historians there were political, diplomatic, social, cultural historians. They believed in the study of history, and they really inspired me to go to graduate school. Then I went to graduate school at the University of Virginia, which is in many respects a fine institution, but which had been co-opted by postmodernists. And I found myself sitting in class after class with no discussion whatsoever. Military history was right out. I was told that if you want to write a dissertation on military history, you're not going to get a job, period, and I don't want to advise you. Class after class, endlessly talking about theory, the meaning of reality, and the capstone was a colloquium on German history taught by an Israeli professor, in which, after talking endlessly about the meaning of reality for class after class, some young postmodernists said, there really was no Holocaust. It was all a construction, a narrative construction. It never really happened. And the professors, it's true. Okay, we're getting to the point of Holocaust denial here. That's the depths of insanity to which it will go. So you have the academic snobbery on the one hand that dismisses military history and the military as an institution, indeed, on campuses. It's worse in some places than in others, as we shall hear. But then, on the other hand, it's been relegated, the study of military history, in many ways to the field of pop history. Pop history, which has, I want to say this delicately, become enthralled with the David McCullough view of every teacher must be a storyteller. That the goal is to entertain, the goal is to tell good stories, to have fun. Make history fun. Make military history fun. Tell the story of grand cavalry charges. And as I see with students nowadays, there's very little sense of grasping at knowledge, grasping at truth, making an effort to discover what happened. No sense of edification. Instead, it's sit back, professor, entertain me. Or writer, author, historian, military historian, entertain me, give me a thrilling story. If I'm not thrilled, you're at fault. So good military history and Washington's legacy specifically in this sense to the nation has really been lost at that intersection. And I think we need to find a way to recover that. So thank you all. I have to say that I want to thank General Bunting, Steve Balch for inviting me. The NAS is the first academic conference I've been to in many, 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 many years where I've actually found the sessions interesting and edifying. So it's been a great pleasure, and thank you all.